My name's Miranda Assi and I'm here at the Maisto Associati booth at the 73rd IFA Congress here in London. And I'm joined by Jim Gadwood of Miller and Chevalier. Jim is an expert on interest deduction and limitations. Jim, can we start by talking about the difference between the US and the EU approach to interest deduction limitation?
Of course. I guess the place to start is probably by observing that the EU has adopted the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, or the ATAD. The ATAD provides a framework for an interest limitation rule, but allows for some flexibility for individual member states to customize the interest limitation as they see fit in their own jurisdiction. In contrast, in the United States, we have just a single rule that's been codified in the Internal Revenue Code in something known as Section 163J. So in that sense, there is a bit of a distinction between the US and the EU. I think a more apples-to-apples comparison would be sort of comparing and contrasting the US with an individual member state. Having said that, I think the general gist of the rules between the EU and the US are very similar. Both have adopted an earnings-based fixed ratio rule, wherein a taxpayer's net interest expense is limited to a fixed percentage of the taxpayer's earnings, typically EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Beyond that general similarity, though, there are certainly some differences, and I would say that in general, the US rule as compared to the average EU implementation is probably less taxpayer favorable, and that manifests itself in a couple ways. One is the absence of a group ratio rule in the United States, as well as the absence of a number of the exceptions that are common for EU member states, for example, as regards public infrastructure projects and banking and financial institutions.
And how does the interest deduction limitation as introduced by the 2017 Cuts and Jobs Act affect the group structure of US multinationals investing abroad?
Well, when it comes to U.S. multinationals investing abroad, they certainly need to keep an eye on the fixed ratio rule that's in the United States, and that will certainly result in some adjustment to the leverage level for that U.S. multinational investing outbound. However, I think the bigger effect that we have seen is on multinationals coming inbound into the United States. Historically, we had seen wholly owned subsidiaries with a non-U.S. parent company being fairly highly leveraged with related party debt, generating interest expense and interest deductions in the U.S. Through outbound interest payments. And we're seeing less of that today following the interest limitation rules. So I would say that when it comes to wholly owned subsidiaries with non-U.S. parent companies, we're seeing a higher percentage of equity as compared to debt in that capital structure.
And could the interaction between the recent US and EU interest limitation rules make it more difficult for US multinationals to deduct their global interest cost?
I wouldn't say that the interaction would have that consequence. I think the rules, each of them standing alone, may very well have that consequence. I think one of the interesting things that I think has yet to really be discussed and analyzed is the extent to which the rules may operate to create double taxation or overtaxation. If interest deductions are disallowed in the borrower's jurisdiction but are fully taxed in the lender's jurisdiction, that raises some interesting questions.
But what about the risk of moving corporate debt between jurisdictions to cope with new interest limitation rules? Could that be regarded as an abusive practice in some countries?
I think I can't say that that is impossible. However, I see the risk of that as fairly low. I think it's important to remember that, at least as a general matter, a lot of the capitalization decisions that companies have in terms of deciding on a portion of equity and debt is made by the finance and treasury functions. And I think if decisions are being led by that function, the risk of sort of tax authorities asserting abuse is low. In the United States, we do have some rules that can recharacterize debt as equity, so that may present a problem, but I think as long as you can steer clear of that, I see the risk of that argument as fairly low.
Fantastic. Jim Gadwood, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.